Welcome everyone. I think everybody knows me. Yes, so I'm going to introduce myself, but I will have the great pleasure to introduce my colleague friend, Professor Alexey Voinov, who joined, distinguished professor, sorry Alexey, joined the School of Information. I'm jealous, that's all. I'm just senior professor. Information, Systems and Modeling, ISM, at the Faculty of Engineering and IT of the University of Technology Sydney. And may I say that UTS had a fantastic draw with Alexey. I'm pretty jealous, but that's okay. We're going to collaborate. Alexey is leading the Faculty Center on Persuasive Systems for Wise Adaptive Living. Persuade, I like that. Before joining UTS, Alexey was Professor of Spatial-Temporal Systems Modeling for Sustainability Science at ITS University of Twente. Prior to that, he was coordinating the Chesapeake Research Consortium Community Modeling Program and was also Principal Researcher Scientist at the Johns Hopkins University. He has spent 1 year with the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowship Program working with the Army Corps of Engineers. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, when was that? Okay. You'll mention it? Great. For over 10 years, he was with the Institute for Ecological Economics, University of Maryland and Vermont. He has his Master of Science and PhD from Moscow State University, Russia. He's a keen advocate of stakeholder involvement in modeling and decision making. That's where our paths crossed many years ago. And he wrote a book on system science and modeling for ecological economics. And today, Alexey won't talk about all these things. He's going to talk about persuasive systems for wise adaptive living. Alexey, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me. First time at this university. A little bit more than a year in Australia. Still trying to figure out how things are working here. And
Should
also,
be easy, mate. Should be easy, mate.
So basically, I wasn't exactly sure what kind of audience I'm going to be talking to. I'm not exactly sure what are your expectations. So it's going to start fairly generic, just for the logic of the presentation. If you get really bored, if you know all this, just maybe let me know, and I can slip a few slides because I've got lots of them. So basically, I have this opportunity to, in a way, introduce our new center, which has been started just 4 months ago, and talk about why I feel also very passionate about doing this. So first of all, like a overall picture, the Anthropocene. So Royal Geographic Society discussing new geological period with the name Anthropocene. As you probably know, it's basically the idea that we are now running the show. So the humans are becoming gradually a geological factor. Therefore, this idea that we have to come up with a new term, now we, instead of Holocene, we'll be gradually moving to Anthropocene to indicate that it's the humans now who are doing stuff on this planet. And also something that the IGBP has come up with is this period of great acceleration. If you look at some of these trends, you can see that most of them are really exponential, and that covers pretty much everything, starting with large dams, water use, all sorts of funny indicators like GDP, world population, and so on and so on. The population is actually pretty interesting to show on the logarithmic scale, and you can really see that until somewhere here it was kind of exponential, then it became really faster than exponential. And this is where things become really kind of scary, because for me to realize that during my lifetime the population on this planet tripled is hard. Just to think about it, like 3 times more people during my own lifetime. Similar trends with the economic indicators, also faster than exponential. Similar indicators in how we manage to ruin our climate. And here's the real evidence of us being a geological factor. I don't know how many of you still remember there was this eruption of the Icelandic volcano. I'm not going to try to pronounce its name. Sorry. This is the amount of CO2 that this volcano emitted during its eruption. As some of you may know, during this eruption it has emitted quite a lot of ash into the atmosphere, fine grain, which prevented airplanes to fly. And as a result, for a couple of weeks, all the air transportation was halted in Northern Europe. Because the planes were on the ground, this is how much CO2 emissions was actually avoided. So there was 205,000 tons that were saved by keeping the airplanes on the ground. We have just witnessed the first carbon neutral volcano eruption. In fact, it's not just carbon neutral, it's actually carbon negative. We managed to kind of save this amount of carbon from being lots of stuff going on. Of course, we are ruining the planet in a lot of different ways. The species extinction is at its highest. People are talking about the annihilation of nature, the sixth mass extinction in the history of the planet. This is an interesting way to look at it. Gosh, I keep pressing the wrong button. This is the ratio of the, this is the biomass. The red line over here is the total biomass of humans 10,000 years ago. The green column over here is the total biomass of living other wild animals 10,000 years ago. And this is today, 2015. This is the wild animals, and this is the humans plus all the domesticated animals. So it's 12,000 times change in the ratio. This was 1 to 200, and here we have 60 to 1. You would think that we're doing really good for ourselves on the social kind of front. Not exactly so. Really good for some. Apparently 62 individuals own as much as 3.5 billion people around the world. And actually these are numbers that have been already revisited. I think today it's 18. So in a way, wealth has been concentrated to such an extent that you can very easily see why for these 18 individuals, the rest of the world really doesn't matter. So if you're talking about the social unrest that this can cause on the background of changing climate and the general disruption, depletion of natural resources, you inevitably start thinking about the quote from this guy who said that what we do is really comparable, and all the technology comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. So, is that really where we're going? Food for thought. So, we do get aware of this and we try to somehow do something. We come up with some interesting ideas such as sustainability. The definition of sustainability talks about meeting the needs of our present generation without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. Problem is that we really don't know what needs we're talking about. Maslow came up with this hierarchy of needs when we basically start with some physiological needs, then there's safety, love, esteem, self-actualization, all these kinds of stuff which we basically agree that they're really needed. Today, a lot of people would actually claim that this is the real need. The rest can wait. So what are the needs? Which needs? When the Brundtland Commission was writing the report, they didn't even know about this. So how can we possibly project the needs for the future generations if our own needs are constantly changing even during our lifetime? And since I'm reaching this level, I kind of feel more or less comfortable showing you this diagram, but there's also a lot of things happening in a variety of different ways. People think about the surrounding world very differently. This would be a great place to put a huge city. Yeah, really. So, what are the values? They're different. It's naive, really, to project our values and preferences and impose them on our successors. The only thing that we really know is that we don't know what should be sustained. It's even less clear what can be sustained. Very much agree with Matthew Chu, who wrote this. So there are some other definitions of sustainability which also which don't talk about needs, but they talk about some kind of preservation of some kind of status quo. So we don't want the total capital of the system to be equal or greater. We want the ability of system to maintain its structure. In a way, when we talk about sustainability, we think about something like this. So we were growing, now we want to keep something intact. But where? There's really no social agreement and no decision at which level do we want to keep this longevity. Should it be here, or maybe just a little bit higher? Or maybe we're already too high and we should go back? I mean, these discussions are not really happening. In fact, it's kind of bothering me that if you talk to most of the people, nobody really thinks about what life they imagine, let's say 10 years from now. Do you regularly go through this kind of exercise? How would you like your kids to live? Is it something like this, like some kind of eco-utopia where everything is green and nice and very pleasant? Is this what we really want to sustain? Or maybe this? Also sustainable, also possible. Or maybe we'll actually get here. This is from Mad Max movie. I would say that this kind of situation is also sustainable. It can be sustained for a pretty long period of time at this level. Have we really chosen the level at which we want to sustain? So that's my problem with sustainability. I have other problems, but I'm not going to go there at the moment. So really, before we want to sustain something, we really want to decide what we want to sustain, right? And that kind of brings us to the issue that there should be some kind of a social compromise about where are we going, what do we want to be, where do we want to be, and then we can start thinking about how do we do it. Especially knowing that there have been all these projections coming back from Limits to Growth about the inevitable meltdown of our livelihood as we know it. So the sustainable development is really something we should care about after we have some kind of socially acceptable limits for the size of our human involvement, our enterprise on this planet. And then we really want to have the ability to stay on track, to stay within these limits. The question is, how do we really get to this social compromise? And that's where it becomes even more interesting, because obviously we're talking about somehow managing people's understanding, managing people's behavior, and that's where social engineering comes into place. A lot of things, for some reason, are taken as a given. If you look at most of the documents today, a lot of them start with the assumption that we have to feed 9 billion people in, let's say, 15 or 20 years from now. Right? Nobody, for some reason, even asks why there should be 9 billion. Why can't we stop earlier? It's politically incorrect to ask these questions. We assume that GDP has to only continue to grow, and the higher it grows, the better. It's a given. Listen to Scott Morrison or all our leaders on TV at any point. They would be talking about how cool life is as long as GDP is growing. Now, not to mention that GDP is quite a meaningless indicator. Again, if it grows, it means that we're just continuing on the same path of consuming our natural resources. So the more we consume, the better we are. So, and there is this inherent assumption that actually human behavior is not something that is easy to change. Well, in reality, it can be changed. And if we look at the history, for example, how consumerism became a fact of life. Do you think it has always been there? No. It's a deliberately created behavior of the society. The consumer society started to develop at the beginning of last century, in the 1920s or 30s. And this guy happened to be a nephew of Sigmund Freud, who actively used his methods in promoting and developing his message. This was eagerly supported by government and labor union, and it was really the lifestyles that were expected to provide full employment, to improve living conditions. Corporate strategies were all about this, and this was deliberately created. In fact, that was one of the first attempts to use mass media, for instance, to create the public acceptance of women's smoking. Just for the fun of it, take a look at some of the ads of those times. And imagine some of them today. That would be offensive, right? This would be terrible. How can you? Santa smoking? What are we talking about? This is horrible. Yet, this is mainstream advertisement, which was absolutely normal. Some of it was just sexist. What's happening? We're back. So the harder the wife works, the cuter she looks. You like it? How about it?
The man said nothing.
Yeah, I mean, the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. I mean, this is okay. This is also okay. Cocaine toothbrush. Enjoy. Revolvers. Very safe. Accidental discharge, impossible. 7-Up, yes, better than breast milk. So, we are laughing, right? But how is this different from what we're looking at today? Another thing, fashion. Isn't this also something that's being constantly imposed upon us? Also seen as the positive proof of global warming, right? So that's something that we are actually seeing on a daily basis, and that's brought to us by this multi-billion advertisement industry, which is successfully modifying our behavior, our preferences, our values, and doing it all the time. In fact, this also applies to the lobbying campaigns. This is the ratio of the amount of money that's being spent by so-called climate skeptics divided by those who are doing climate research. 10 times more, going up to 30 times more. So, non-surprisingly, there is so much skepticism about climate change because that's what's being fed to the people. I was quite impressed by this cartoon, which goes back to 1889, and it is called The Bosses of the Senate. And it's not very well focused, but these are different trusts or monopolies or big corporations. Back to advertisement. This is today. It's okay, right? That's what we're used to. That doesn't bother us. Bacon, enjoy new cheesy bacon. How many of you actually are aware that there is a World Health Organization decision that basically classifies processed meats as carcinogenic to humans, among the highest 5 possible rankings shared by alcohol, asbestos, or silicon cigarettes. This is their website. Check if you wish. So, despite this, we are still advertising it, just like we advertise cigarettes. Nothing has really changed. If you go to the grocery, the fact that they're selling carcinogenic goods is not really seen as something that is worth complaining about. It's okay. Again, not to mention the fact that actually eating meat is very much responsible for our climate change. It creates deforestation, it creates tons of waste, it uses a lot of water, and if you look at the CO2 footprint, this is lamb and beef compared to fruit, milk, vegetables, beans, tofu. So it's like 2 to 40 orders of magnitude. And that's the amount of CO2 that's associated with these goods. Yet it's okay to advertise these goods, and that's what we're doing. Moreover, we see clear evidence how our devices, how our life is engineered in order to program our behavior in certain ways. It has been observed that kids these days spend more than 6 hours per day looking at their iPhone or mobile phone. And that's because the design is made in such a way that they attract their attention and they make them addicted. This company, hacker neuroscientists, actually deliberately develops tools that would drive your behavior on your smartphone, reinforced by knowledge of how the brain works, how the neurons interact, to make you do certain things. And this can be also applied for some very good causes, such as, for instance, this one, where by designing certain operations of the mobile device, they were providing positive reinforcement for people to maintain their diet, to maintain their exercising, and they have seen a 21% improvement. It can also be used to increase your shopping success. So by 30% positive on-screen praise about your selection, add items to your cart. You added 30% more items than before. So kids are spending 10 times more time on their mobile devices than in 2011. There's actually a letter from the American Psychological Association that calls attention to the unethical practice of psychologists using hidden manipulation techniques to hook children on societal media and video games. And you think that changing human behavior is difficult? No. It's happening all the time. So what we're really thinking, that probably there's this proverb, live with wolves, you learn to howl. Maybe we should also learn to howl. If they're doing this to us, perhaps we also need to learn some persuasive technologies to actually modify human behavior in the right way. To perhaps restore some of our more natural habits that are not so focused on our consumer behaviors. So persuade. Well, we changed it a little bit, so from persuade it became persuade, which stands for Persuasive Systems for Wise Adaptive Living. Actually, it turns out that this is the old spelling of the word, so it's even correct. And the idea that we are trying to somehow push forward is to apply and develop these kinds of persuasive technologies, but in order to promote sustainable, wise living, and realizing that we're living on a finite planet and we better take care of it. The understanding is also that in many cases, by just changing our behavior, we can achieve a lot. Some of the methods that we're exploring are systems and different sorts of modeling, social computing, data visualization, and gamification. So I'll briefly mention a couple of projects that we're working on right now, and then we can probably just go on to questions. Well, systems and models, yes, everything is connected, and here's an example of an agricultural supply chain, which is one of the things we're exploring right now. Now, this thing is definitely not very well focused. I don't know how to change it. So the usual kind of supply chain that we're dealing with takes you through this process that starts with the production of a certain food supply, and it goes through the distribution networks, through retail stores to the consumer, and then the consumer also participates somehow in the disposal. The traditional supply chain actually looks only at this part of it. They don't really look at how the items have been produced, and we really are not very much concerned about how they are being consumed. But if you want to be talking about sustainable supply chains, we really want to bring into account the effects of the production on the agricultural side, plus the effects of consumption. Because especially if we talk about organic production, for example, it's pretty hard to compete with conventional production on prices unless you can really manipulate consumers to somehow also impact the prices by their behavior, by their choices. So that's where the behavior of consumers can actually impact the type of production that's happening on the farm, the choice of organic versus inorganic practices, how the what kind of pesticides or fertilizers are being used or not being used. Also, the post-harvest activities, the packaging that is used, whether you want it all in plastic or not. And definitely your behavior also impacts your waste treatment. So, starting with some assumptions, which are spelled out here, but basically we're talking about the fact how people may influence each other. We moved on to building a small agent-based model that we kind of centered on the Sydney CBD with a focus on organic versus inorganic wines. And the assumption is that when you make the decision about purchasing the bottle of wine, what can possibly change your preference and move you from conventional wine to organic wine? One of the assumptions is that maybe if you see other people buying organic wine in the shop. The other assumption is that maybe it's your neighborhood circle. If your neighbors, if at a party, for instance, your closest friend meet, and that's the kind of wine that they prefer. Or it's obviously information, advertisement, and different sorts of information that is being circulated. So we built this little consumer model where different decisions are being made, the human behavior is being somehow tracked. And on the other end, we also have a system dynamics model that actually tracks the growth of grapes depending upon the different types of agricultural practices that are being chosen, with the idea that perhaps by playing with some of these parameters we can help farmers decide what could be the best pricing strategy, how much more you can actually expect how much higher price you can expect the consumers to still absorb. We can track the environmental impact of the production and consumption. There is the part, this was all built in AnyLogic, and there's a part that also keeps track of the usual inventory and the delivery. And as a result, by playing with some of these parameters, you can modify and assume how people can be changing their behavior based on some parameters. How successful this will be in terms of changing the actual behavior is yet to be seen. But at least the hope is that by providing farmers with these tools, they can get a better understanding of the closing of the circle. So they can actually also track the impacts of consumers on their choices. Possible outcomes, we expect that the farmers can investigate the impact of replacing some of the conventional practices for organic ones, the role of the market, the role of the human behavior is somehow to be tracked. Ideally, of course, it would be nice to build this as a participatory modeling exercise with inviting these stakeholders up front. So far, we're just doing surveys and asking people about their behavior. What we learn, and what we learned the hard way, is that actually engaging farmers in any of these efforts is a heck of a problem. Nobody really wants to work with you. They're all busy on their own farms. Moreover, they're very protective of their data. So with all my excitement about participatory modeling, so far with the farmers, we have actually failed in this case. And I know that there are some other trials and people are trying to do that. We have failed so far. Not giving up. Okay, so participatory modeling, I'm sure everybody knows what that is. Yes? No? Yes? Good. So we focus on the process and we focus on the learning. So basically the essence is that we're engaging people in this discussion to make sure that they also learn from each other and from us, and while we learn from them. The process can be very long, going through all these different loops, and it can also never end. But during this process, we obviously learn a lot. Something we also noticed in how participatory modeling is happening is that there is a bit of a problem with how the methods are actually chosen. This maybe also talks to what you'll be doing in this course. We came up with this little diagram recently as an effort of a SUSINC group, SUSINC-funded group, which we tried to kind of categorize different types of methods that have been and are used in participatory modeling. And obviously each of different workflows can go through a series of these methods, or it can just end up somewhere very upfront. You can do some brainstorming and that will be the end of it, or from brainstorming you can go to rich pictures. But there's really a huge number of methods that potentially can be used. Problem is that in way too many situations, people come with their method, and this choice of methods doesn't really happen. You kind of impose your tools, your methods, on the stakeholders with whom you work. This was quite clearly seen from this little survey that we ran when we asked people what kind of methods they use, and use familiar methods, agree and strongly agree. So apparently everybody prefers, which is natural. I mean, we like to use the methods that we know. And everybody tries to use them. And that's where it becomes confusing. Because at the same time, when we start to ask people about how they actually ended up with a method, they started to tell me that, well, they actually select methods based on the problem at hand. They select methods based on the community involved, and this is also So how can this actually be married with this? I don't know. Unless everybody knows all the methods, which probably is not exactly the case. So it almost seems like we know how it should be done, but this is how we do it. So we know that this is how we would like to look, and that's why we say that, yes, we should select method this way. But in reality, this is what's happening. And this is a bit problematic because, especially in participatory modeling, if you're actually imposing a method on your stakeholder group, this is not very fair because you are already in a kind of an advantage compared to them because you are a scientist and you potentially may know a lot more. But now you're even using and expanding this advantage even further because you're also saying that, and this is the method that we'll be using, and this is my method. So, you know this metaphor of a hammer and nail. What seems to be happening is that once you learn to use a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So maybe you don't really need to apply this method. Maybe you can start something very much, do something very much differently. So that's what we're trying to describe in this paper, also talking about the different ways that these methods can be evaluated and chosen. There's also this portal that we're strongly advocating to get people in the participatory modeling arena together to share their ideas, their methods, projects. If you're not there yet, and if you're doing participatory modeling, please consider to sign up and join. There might be a problem during the next week or two because we're moving the whole website to another server, but this is just temporary. Social computing. The other thing that's happening is we're all on mobile phones. There's growth of social media, increasing popularity. Everybody wants to do it. Everybody has it. Use of web services. But immediately you find these problems that you run into this whole notion of truths about non-truths, fake news. And this is an interesting quote from Jonathan Swift, 1710. If a lie be believed only for an hour, it has done its work, and there is no farther occasion for it. Falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it. So that when men come to be undeceived, it's too late. Sometimes we really see how this happens. Sometimes we see how people get really fooled by what they're reading. And there's plenty of that kind of stuff on the web. This is for real. This has been there in 2015. I don't remember this actually happening, right? But it was there. And what's also interesting is that by living in this imagined world, we are creating our history. So if we honestly believe something and we start to act upon this belief, we are creating our history on the basis not of the reality, but our perceptions of this reality. And as a result, we are actually creating something that may be totally wrong. So there's definitely some challenges. How can we actually engage the society? How can we make sure that the truth is somehow true? And in one of our projects that we're running right now, you'd be surprised. There was this kind of an idea that every now and then we have to go through this hazard reduction burn process, right? In order to make sure that forest fires don't go out of control. There is this method for back burning or hazard reduction burning, where artificially pieces of forests or bushland are set on fire. You see these kinds of pictures. It has quite a bit of health effects. People with asthma can really suffer. it can run out of control. So there are alternatives. One of them is actually called mechanical load reduction, when you can, in fact, try to collect this stuff and put it to use, potentially for bioenergy production or for timber production. Back in Netherlands, we've done a little project looking at mowing the lawns along the roadside, collecting this vegetation. Now it's being mowed and lost, and nothing has been used. If this biomass is actually used to produce bioenergy, with all the roads and all the roadsides in Netherlands, they could almost meet all of their Paris Accord agreements in CO2 reduction. Similarly, why can't we also start collecting this biomass in some of these forests, at least along the roads and not far from the residential properties that are at risk? You'd be surprised, but actually there's a tremendous history of opposition of collecting woody biomass from forests. If you start talking to people, it very much depends whether they actually know what you're talking about. So we ran this survey, and with very kind of mixed results. So positive 63, but then there's 33 which are negative. And they are extremely active about making the point that you should not be doing this. So, talking to people, the other part that we're doing here is actually analyzing some Twitter feeds. It tells you a lot about what you can expect from this sort of interaction. Of course, visualization, very important, so that our models are also producing results that can be somehow understood and perceived. Just a few examples. I love these cartograms. So this is the area of different countries. If you look at population, this is how it will look. Now we have area in proportion to population. If you look at emissions, this is how we look. You can keep looking at Australia. So in terms of population, emissions, a little bit better. Extraction, now we get it. Now we're almost as the size of the land. There are different ways we can design all our smart meters to make people also attractive. If the kids can get hooked and addicted to their smartphones, maybe we can also make people addicted and attracted to some of the meters that will be tracking their behavior, tracking their CO2 emissions. And the other thing we were also exploring is how can we use serious games. And this is one example of a game we put together to try to visualize and understand our futures. So basically, like I mentioned, we very rarely think about where we're going. We keep on treading on a day-to-day basis without really asking ourselves, where do we want to end? There are, in fact, some research that comes with these kind of 6 different scenarios of possible societal or planetary developments. And unfortunately, some of the conventional worlds like this very often and very easily tend to converge into something way more unpleasant, whereas the eco-communalism, the new paradigm, the eco kind of utopian types, which look really great, are also pretty hard to sell. Exactly because they defy the conventional approaches. So we took a very simple model, which is a system dynamics model called mini world, with 3 variables: population, economic production, and environmental degradation. It produces these kinds of dynamics which kind of resemble World 3, or the limits to growth. And on top of it, we build a little card game where all these cards can be chosen, and each of these cards, they modify some of the parameters in the model. And so people start choosing what do they want to build. A fertility clinic, a gym, a hospital, a family planning clinic, labor rights agency, and so on and so on. All of these things modify some of the parameters, and your goal is to try to keep your variables on your last island within certain limits. To make things more interesting, there's also quests which are actually individual. So you are asked to try to attain a certain goal as an individual, and therefore people start to compete with each other to somehow reach their own goals. But if by reaching your own goals you kill the whole island, game over, everybody loses. So there's a collaborative and competitive element in the game. To make things even more interesting, we added some events like the acid rain, some protest, invasion of aliens. If you manage to maintain your planet, your island within these limits, after 15 rounds, you win. People got quite hooked and interested. Students played for several hours, no complaints. So, to conclude, it's good to be an optimist, and this guy really had this idea that we are transitioning to a noosphere, and the noosphere is the new state of the planet, the reign of human mind, consciousness, wisdom, and intellect. Are we there? Not yet. But sounds like a good idea. Sounds like a good goal. So that's what we're trying to do with in Persuade, and primarily also trying to persuade and to communicate the message. This is the author of the peak oil concept, if you know what that is. Our ignorance is not so vast as our failure to use what we already know. Let's try to improve it. Thank you.
Feedback, so just talking about my whole research. Good. I have to go back to it. Questions, comments?
Thanks, Professor Voinov, for your insight. So basically, we currently have an ongoing project to looking at. So we are very interested in the topic you mentioned before. So currently, we have an ongoing project to look at the student performance based on the online behavior. So one of our conclusions is that with good learning performance, actually they are carrying some very productive and creative apps online. But by contrast, the school with poor performance, in fact, in the student, they are carrying some very dodgy apps with their wireless. But this is a question for us. It's a chicken or egg. Is it because they are the good student, so that's why they are playing the good apps, or because they're playing the good apps, that's why they got the good learning performance? So we try to understand any kind of the driving factor behind this phenomenon. So basically, my question is, do you see any potential to adopt your Persuade system on this question, and how can we change the student behavior to have a very good learning performance?
Well, first of all, there's no Persuade system, okay? So what Persuade is trying to do is trying to develop systems that could potentially change this. And I think it's a very valid topic and a very valid goal to see perhaps using the same type of neurolinguistic or brain science that would make some of those good games more attractive and would make them more likely to be used by students. But to answer your question whether it's a chicken or an egg, first of all, of course, I don't know. My gut feeling is that probably both. Probably it's just one of those positive feedbacks and self-reinforcing processes that simply by chance you can jump either on one, can end up either on one slope of the mountain or the other, but once you are there, you are dragged further down the road, either becoming less productive or becoming more productive, simply because you chose the wrong or the right game to play. But that's what becomes very difficult to control, and probably also what you want to do is look at the early stages of child development and make sure that the kids, especially in their early years, learn to distinguish between the good and the bad types of applications.
So in one of your slides, you mentioned the farmers. Do you still remember one slide you mentioned that by changing different parameters, because some of the farmers, they might influenced by the neighbors and the behavior. So, and also you mentioned that by changing some of the parameters, you can see can try out different scenarios. So what's the technique behind
I mean, this is just a model. There is no technique. This is the model that can potentially help us understand how certain parameters may be changing the behavior. But it's a long way before we can actually claim that this model has been validated, has been proven to be correct, and that we can use it reliably to make these changes.
Sure.
Why do you think participatory modeling is so hard to do in Australia? I picked
No, not in Australia, with farmers. With farmers in Australia. It's just my unsuccessful experience. That's it. I have no reason to generalize.
So I can extrapolate from that. I've experienced that for a few years. When I was working in Saro, we pitched the idea in Chile, and they got it right away. But we were coming back, offering it to government agencies, and there was interest, but they never invested in it.
Ah, so you agree?
I can see it's more widespread than farmers.
Okay.
If I may pitch, I think what you described was what I've experienced working with CIRAD, so French agency with French money going into Africa, South America, Asia. Back to your point, not only you come with your knowledge, your methods, and your money, and you're the king.
Well,
and you impose your method on people who are desperate to change something.
And I think that this is a very, very big difference and a totally different story when you actually pay to participants $1 a day, and they're happy to sit in your workshops. How much do you pay a farmer in Australia to spend the day at your workshop? I don't think $1 would do that. So one of my untested hypotheses, but probably would be interesting to analyze. I think that there is a disproportionately large number of participatory modeling projects that have been done in the developing countries just because of that.
Oh, it was a big fight with Christophe and François and others. I was the one saying that, said no.
You would expect that in a place like Australia would be more common practice.
No, I wouldn't. Primarily, well, first of all, I think that farmers are also a very special type of people, and I can see why it's hard to get farmers to participate, because probably they're also quite individualistic, just because of their trade, especially small farmers. There's also market mechanisms. They're protective of their knowledge, of their technologies, of their cultivation practices. They don't know, maybe you'll be reporting this to some governmental agency that will come after them. I think they're also scared about that.
If I may, I haven't played many games in Australia, only 3, and 2 were really with indigenous communities, and it's another thing for different reasons. The farmers within Western Australia on the wheat belt. It was about adapting to climate change threats and to the pretty bad year in terms of drought. So we piggybacked on a situation where, again, people were desperate and they engaged in the women, they engaged even more than the men. So from that perspective, we didn't have to pay the people that came. We offered food, so it's a bit of a reward anyway. And that was a good experience, but I think mainly because we were on top of the wave.
Urgency, yes. That's definitely a good point. If you can come to them at some kind of a peak emergency situation, they will definitely listen. Just like most of these fire protection responses have been collected when we went right after the Tata bushfire, which was, you know what that is. And they were quite willing to talk.
So now's a good moment.
Probably.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah.
Ricardo.
I have to bring this to the area that I am interested when we talk about system of systems. And then everything you mentioned here, drive into system of systems, all those, so even farmers have a system of their own, and we are all competing, and so on. So the question is, when we create those system of systems, created by man, we will try to create mechanisms that will make them to desire to belong to that system. They need to have some sort of incentive to be part of that and say, this is good for me. And they do that because they have this selfishness, right? Say, it's best for me, then I will be part of that. But we see that in those complex systems, there are always losers and winners, right? So it's not possible to have all the components of those systems to be efficient to the point that they will get the best for them. Some will have to sacrifice again to be part of that. So this maybe is the billion-dollar question, right? So then it is a kind of to convey this message, whether these principles of understanding, not only to the bottom of those systems, but say politicians and everybody else, to understand that no matter what you do, right, the river will run to the ocean. So then it's better to understand those mechanisms and make the best decision possible. And since someone will lose, there must be a way to compensate for that. Okay, so that would it be possible to design those complex systems in a kind of a socio-economic, political sense to bring this balance, right, that will compensate and will make people to want to belong just because it's the best for me?
Well, I guess the short answer is yes. It's probably possible. It's very difficult. But I think that closing the loop and showing that at the end of the day, you can only win if you cooperate and if you participate in these interactions, is something that we can demonstrate with some of the models that we're building. The problem is that several times you use the word better, best. That's where it also becomes difficult, because the metrics that we use to identify better, best, worse are also fluid. They may change. And when you say that there is no possibility for everybody to win, I totally agree, but when we are talking about winning, we are back to the indicators. Winning in terms of what? You can be winning along one dimension and you can be losing along the other dimension. And wrapping these indicators together becomes also an exercise in some kind of social dynamics, because that's where you need to put weights on these indicators. That's where you end up in some kind of a multi-criteria decision system, right? So, I already forgot where I was.
Maybe you say that you are in the right way, so then the way to resolve this very difficult problem is through conscientization, to education, to understanding.
The point that it's a different presentation, it's a different story, but when you say that this is a very difficult problem, and it's therefore difficult to solve, I would say that actually it's up to us to draw the boundaries and to decide what is actually the problem that we're solving. If we try to put everything into our model, then we're definitely failing. Then the whole purpose of modeling is defeated. But again, I would say that in so many situations, we actually know what we should be doing. And we know what is the simple model involved. And yes, you can include a lot of other parameters and a lot of other factors, but we can probably guess what the trend is, and we can probably understand where we're heading. You don't need to go into all the details to understand that something has to be changed.
That was an interesting presentation. I totally agree with you that human behavior needs to change in a way that we have a more sustainable environment and future for us and for next generation. But for this kind of persuading and promoting methods, of course, consumers' behavior and producers' behavior are very important. But have you looked at the government's behavior? Because that is something that affects the whole system a lot. Say, for example, you said that during your lifetime, the population became trickle. This definitely can be affected because, say, for example, people try to eat more healthy, do exercises so they have longer life period. But at the same time, it's highly affected by the policies that the government has, like vaccination and those sort of things, or all governments around the world over the last 3-4 decades, which decreased the fertility in newborn babies. So, and the governments, if they change the behavior even a little bit, that can affect the whole system a lot. So, is there any way that we can use this program?
Well, first of all, I guess the idea here is that if we're still thinking in terms of a democratic society, then in most cases we deserve the government which we have. Which means that it's the individuals, you said consumers, let's say individuals. We appear not only as consumers, we act as individuals who also make certain decisions, and these decisions can go all the way from putting a solar panel on the top of your roof to driving a BMW car at a high speed on the highway. It's our personal individual decisions, our also individual decisions, what kind of government we elect, right? So in a way, like I said, if we assume that we're living in a democratic society, the government is in a way a function of our individual decisions, right? But I totally agree that the role of governments is absolutely also crucial. And when I'm talking about persuasion, I'm talking not about persuading only us, but also persuading them. But going back to my original assumption, you will probably be more successful persuading them if you can actually show them that they're likely not to do that.
But there's one difference between, for example, driving the BMW and the government, and that is for car industry and those sort of things, is kind of free market. There are hundreds of choices that you as an individual can go with. But when it comes down to election, you basically have maybe a couple of choices to go with. And
but isn't that part of your decision? I mean, isn't that the kind of constitution that you voted for? I mean, in some European parties, you actually have, how many, 5, 10 different candidates from different
If
parties?
you can choose between Porsche and BMW, that's fine. If you have to choose between Skoda and Tatra, which is probably the case in this country.
No, but I mean that the whole structure of the government and your political organization is also something that can be changed.
Maybe a last comment or question? Now,
So for these persuasive systems, have it been applied to a large scale to drive the behaviours of a large group of people, let's say, in terms of transport behaviours? You know, I don't know, I'm just...
You're asking? Oh,
I'm
yeah.
asking, yes.
I mean,
So has
well,
it been,
persuasive
and how
system, the
it has
idea
been
of
gone?
persuasive technologies has been around for like 20 years or more. And they're very actively used, in fact, in developing software code, in developing, in creating advertisement. So that's where I said that live with wolves, learn to howl. In a way, we're catching up. In a way, we're trying to somehow learn what's been already proven to work. The way the commercials work, I mean, it's amazing how they can get inside our brain and make us buy stuff that we don't need. Very successful.
I might have the last word, if I may. Back to the nudging and nudging for a better future, a better world, and let's not define better. We've got a responsibility there, because as you said, as a society, our culture changes, our needs change, so cigarette and non-cigarette. So of course you're going to tell me, well, we've got the boundaries of the planet and we know where we should not go, but the choice we might nudge now, we have no real certainty that they will be the right choices in the future. So there's a strong responsibility. We think we're on the right side of on the bright side of the force, but there's a lot of risks attached to it and liability attached to it.
With big power comes big responsibility. I think it's a quote from Spider-Man. Well, I must actually disappoint you. It was actually written by Voltaire about 200 years ago.
But he didn't have such a sexy uniform.
No, he didn't know how to climb on the ceiling, so nobody noticed. But I think that the only approach that I would strongly recommend in this case is something called the precautionary principle. So if you know that something can happen, just don't go that close to it. You know? If you know you can fall off this cliff, you don't want to stand on the very edge. It's like we do in our everyday life. It's like we tell our kids, you know, better be safe than sorry. So we know that there are certain limits. We know that there are certain ranges. If you stepped in that range, don't go farther. Stop. Wait. Maybe it's okay. But before you go there, do the assessment. That's my only appeal.
Well, that's going to be the last word for today. Please join me and thank Alexey.